Story 1.
The Morrison family. Exhumation. It was an October morning in 2019 when Robert received the strangest exhumation order of his 15 years as a gravedigger. 3 coffins from the Morrison family, buried exactly 20 years ago, needed to be removed from Mount Pleasant Cemetery for forensic investigation. The reason? Suspicions of arsenic poisoning that had only now been raised by a distant relative. The smell of damp earth and decomposing leaves hung in the morning air, mixed with that characteristic metallic aroma that always precedes disturbing discoveries. In all those years digging graves, Robert had never felt the weight of silence like that morning. The Morrison family, father, mother, and 12-year-old daughter had died within a 3-month interval, all apparently from natural causes. Now, 2 decades later, someone was questioning that version. The air was dense, loaded with a fog that wouldn't dissipate even with a rising sun. His crew was visibly tense. Exhumations always carry a different emotional weight, but this one had something darker hanging over them. Robert clearly remembered the original funeral in 1999. He was young then, just a few years into the profession. But those 3 consecutive burials had deeply marked his memory. First, James, the 45-year-old patriarch who apparently succumbed to sudden pneumonia. 3 weeks later, Margaret, his wife, followed the same fate. And then, in what seemed to be destiny's cruel final blow, little Sarah developed a mysterious fever and died at home, under the care of the same family doctor, Dr. Whitmore. At the time, the entire community was moved by the tragedy. Neighbors whispered about family curses and bad luck, but no one questioned the medical causes. Dr. Whitmore was respected, had cared for half the town's families for more than 20 years. His death certificates were unquestionable. Until that October morning in 2019, they started with the father, James Morrison. The excavation was standard until they reached the coffin level. That's when Tommy, Robert's most experienced assistant, stopped digging and called him with an urgent whisper. "Robert, you need to see this." He crouched down in the grave and saw something that shouldn't be there. Deep scratches on the inside of the coffin lid. Scratches that could only have been made by human nails. Scratches from someone trying to get out. The sound of nails scraping against wood still echoed in Robert's mind. Imagine waking up in absolute darkness, feeling the weight of earth above you, air slowly running out, and the only response to your desperation being the muffled sound of your own nails breaking against solid wood. The marks were deep, systematic, as if James had tried for hours to create an exit that would never come. Tommy, who had worked with Robert for 10 years, turned pale as paper. His lips trembled as he whispered a prayer. Robert tried to maintain professional composure, but felt his stomach churn. In 2 decades of profession, he had seen decomposition, had dealt with violent deaths, terrible accidents, but he had never found such clear evidence that someone had fought for their life inside their own coffin. With trembling hands, Roberto opened the other 2 coffins. Carmen Ramos displayed the same signs: desperate scratches, the fabric of her clothes torn near the hands, unmistakable signs that she had regained consciousness after burial. But it was in little Sarah that they found the most disturbing thing. A note hidden in her pocket, written with the innocence of a child. But before she died, it read, "Daddy wasn't sleeping. Mommy woke up too." The medical examiner accompanying the exhumation remained silent for long minutes. Then he confirmed Robert's most terrible suspicions. All had been buried alive, probably under the effect of some substance that simulates clinical death. The Morrison family had not died of natural causes. They had been deliberately placed in a catatonic state and buried conscious. But there were more details that make this story even more sinister. Little Sarah's note wasn't the only item found. In her clenched fists, she held strands of hair, not her own, but dark hair belonging to an adult person. DNA would later confirm they belonged to Dr. Whitmore, apparently. Sarah had fought against him during her last conscious moments. On the inner walls of Margaret's coffin, they found marks suggesting a terrifying chronology. She had awakened first, scratched methodically for hours, then stopped. The marks resumed a few days later, suggesting she had lost and regained consciousness multiple times. Most disturbing was a pattern in the marks. She had tried to write something, but the letters were too irregular to be deciphered. To this day, 5 years later, Robert can't forget the scratches on those coffin lids. The investigation revealed that Dr. Whitmore had forged the death certificates in exchange for a substantial inheritance from a close relative. 3 innocent people spent their final moments in absolute despair, awakening in the total darkness of their own tombs. That exhumation forever changed how Robert sees his work. Every burial he performs since then, he wonders, is this person really gone? What they discovered later about Dr. Whitmore was even more shocking. The police investigation revealed that he had applied a calculated dose of tetrodotoxin to each family member, the same toxin found in pufferfish, known for inducing a state of paralysis that perfectly simulates clinical death. The victims remained conscious but unable to move or communicate. The motivation was purely financial. Charles Morrison, James's older brother and sole heir to the family fortune, had hired Whitmore to discreetly eliminate the family that stood between him and a $2 million inheritance. The plan was perfect. Apparently, natural deaths, legitimate medical certificates, and no suspicion for 2 decades. Roberts says the most disturbing discovery came weeks later, when they analyzed hospital records. Dr. Whitmore had used the same method on at least 6 other families over 20 years. Dozens of people had been buried alive, awakening in the darkness of their coffins, fighting uselessly against the slowest and most terrifying death imaginable. Not all rest in peace. Stay sharp, everyone. To all our amazing viewers and loyal subscribers, we know many of you watch our videos, but haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these stories and want to support this project, please hit subscribe, give the video a like, and share it. Now, enjoy what's coming up.
Story 2.
The discovery at Peaceful Valley Cemetery. It was an ordinary Friday at Peaceful Valley Cemetery when Michael arrived for his father's exhumation. What began as a routine transfer turned into a discovery that would reveal something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Marcus, the gravedigger responsible for the operation, immediately noticed the tension in the air. When Michael approached the open grave, a sensation he had learned to recognize in his 27 years in the profession. Michael Johnson had lost his father, Anthony Johnson, in April 2021, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like many families at the time, they opted for a temporary burial plot, intending to do the exhumation 2 years later. Anthony had been a simple man, a construction worker who had never undergone surgeries or complex medical procedures. His death was sudden, respiratory complications that took him in just 1 week. The exhumation had been postponed from 2023 to 2024 because, according to the cemetery, decomposition had not occurred completely. Michael accepted the explanation, although he found it strange. His father was a thin man, and the dry climate of that region usually accelerated the natural process. But he trusted the cemetery administration, which had served the region for more than 50 years. That Friday morning, Michael arrived accompanied by his sister Sarah and brother-in-law Robert. They had hired Marcus, an experienced gravedigger known in the region for the precision and respect with which he conducted exhumations. The sky was cloudy, with a low fog that wouldn't dissipate even with the growing heat of the day. When Marcus opened the coffin and began separating the bones, Michael immediately noticed something wrong. On the right femur was a metal plate with screws, clearly the result of complex orthopedic surgery. "My father never broke a leg in his life," Michael said, his voice choked. "He never had any surgery." Marcus stopped work immediately. In 2 decades and 7 years of digging graves, he had seen documentation errors, but never a complete body switch. What intrigued him most was the condition of the bones. Despite supposedly being 3 years old, they showed signs of much more advanced decomposition, as if they belonged to someone who had died much longer ago. Sarah, who worked as a nursing technician, examined the bones more closely. "Michael, look at the skull shape. This belonged to a woman. The bone structure was unmistakably feminine, with characteristics any healthcare professional would recognize. But there was another disturbing detail she preferred not to mention in front of her brother. The bones had a strange coloration, almost grayish, different from the normal yellowish tone of decomposition. The cemetery administration confirmed the error. Michael's father's bones had been switched with those of a woman named Helen Williams, who should have been cremated in May 2021. According to the supervisor, an employee had confused the identification tags. It was human error, explained the manager, visibly embarrassed. The employee was fired last week for other similar problems. But the story got complicated when Michael demanded to see his father's correct bones. The cemetery couldn't locate them immediately. Records showed that Helen Williams had been cremated. But if the bones in Anthony's grave were hers, where were the ashes? And more importantly, where was Michael's father? Marcus, who was following everything in silence, made a disturbing observation. "Mr. Michael, I participated in your father's burial. I remember because it was one of the last before the strictest lockdown. The coffin was heavy, very heavy for a man of the build you described." He had noted this observation in his personal notebook at the time, a practice he maintained for quality control. The investigation revealed that Helen Williams had died under mysterious circumstances, found at home after 3 weeks without family contact. When discovered, her body was in an advanced state of decomposition, which would explain the current condition of the bones. Even stranger, Helen had explicitly requested to be cremated in her will, fearing she would not find peace in the earth. Michael's father's bones were finally located a week later in a cremation area where they awaited processing. For some bureaucratic reason, they had never been cremated, just stored. The family was finally able to give Anthony proper rest, but the experience left deep marks on everyone involved. Marcus says that since that day, he always double-checks documentation before any exhumation. What disturbs him most isn't the administrative error itself, but something he observed and never told the Johnson family. During the separation of Helen's bones, he noticed that some of them were scratched, marks that seemed to have been made by fingernails, as if she had fought against something during her final moments. Peaceful Valley Cemetery implemented new identification protocols after the incident. But Marcus says some older employees avoid working in the section where Helen was originally buried. They report a constant feeling of being watched, and on particularly quiet days, the subtle sound of someone scratching wood coming from beneath the earth. Michael Johnson never learned of these details. He preferred to focus on the fact that he can finally visit his father's correct grave and be certain that Anthony rests in peace. But sometimes, during his monthly visits to the cemetery, he notices Marcus watching with special attention to the old grave where the wrong bones were found, as if expecting something to emerge from the soil at any moment. As Marcus learned over his 27 years of digging graves, not everyone rests in peace. Have you ever had an experience that made you question whether the dead really rest where they should? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes human errors reveal truths we'd rather not know.
Story 3.
The coffin that wouldn't open. It was a cloudy Tuesday morning when the crew from a small cemetery in rural Kentucky gathered for a family-authorized exhumation. The oldest gravedigger, Old Arnold, was accustomed to all kinds of situations. But that day, he said later, something in the air felt heavy. The smell of wet earth mixed with an unusual metallic scent that seemed to cling to their clothes and linger in their nostrils long after they should have gotten used to it. The task seemed simple. Remove the remains of a man buried 12 years ago for transfer to another cemetery. Only the burial site was flooded due to rains from the past few weeks. The earth was waterlogged, dark, and exhaled a sour odor more intense than normal. Arnold knew that moisture could accelerate or delay decomposition in unpredictable ways, but this felt different. His crew of 3 men, Jake, Tommy, and young Pete, moved with unusual caution that morning. The grave marker read William Henderson, 1943 to 2011, beloved father and husband. What they didn't know was that William's death had been sudden and unexplained. He'd gone to bed healthy and been found the next morning, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. No autopsy had been performed at the family's request, following their religious beliefs about keeping the body intact. When they finally reached the coffin, they realized the wood was so swollen it seemed fused to the earth. One of the helpers tried to force it open with an iron bar, but the lid wouldn't give. Arnold, experienced as he was, found it strange. Old coffins like this usually break apart easy, but this one seemed to hold tight, as if something inside didn't want to come out. The wood felt unnaturally warm to the touch, despite being buried 6 feet underground in cold, wet soil. When Jake pressed his ear to the coffin, a habit he developed over years of checking for structural integrity, he swore he heard a faint sound, like air slowly escaping, but that was impossible. After 12 years, any gases should have long since dissipated. After nearly 20 minutes of effort, the lid split with a dry crack. What they saw wasn't what they expected. The body was practically intact. Pale skin, preserved clothing, the face recognizable, but the eyes, the eyeballs were still there, shrunken but present, as if watching the men. A suffocating smell filled the air, a mix of decay and something sickly sweet. The strangest part came next. The helper responsible for collecting the remains swore he felt the body was too heavy for the time it had been dead. Arnold had handled hundreds of exhumed bodies, and he knew the weight patterns of decomposition. This felt wrong. The body had the weight of someone recently deceased, not someone who'd been underground for over a decade. But there were more disturbing details. William's fingernails had grown significantly, curling into long, yellowed talons. His hair had continued growing, now reaching his shoulders in greasy, matted strands. Most unsettling of all, his mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp, as if they'd been filed 2 points. Young Pete, on his first exhumation, noticed scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid, deep gouges that looked fresh despite the wood's waterlogged condition. The scratches formed a pattern, almost like letters, but too distorted to read clearly. The removal was completed, but none of them exchanged many words. Arnold, who had seen hundreds of exhumations, confessed later that it was the only time he had trouble sleeping. In the small town, word spread. Some said the man had been buried alive, others that the wet soil had kept more than it should. In the end, everyone who participated in the work agreed never to speak about it around the family. There are things you see in the cemetery that don't need explaining, just respecting, Arnold would say when pressed about that day. The strange thing was, William Henderson's medical records, when finally reviewed months later, showed no signs of the terminal illness his family claimed had killed him. The death certificate listed natural causes, but the attending physician had moved out of state immediately after signing it. The cemetery records showed other anomalies, too. 3 other graves in the same section had been exhumed over the years for various reasons, and all had presented similar oddities. Preserved bodies, scratched coffin lids, and that same unnaturally heavy weight. The groundskeepers started avoiding that section during their evening rounds, claiming they sometimes heard muffled sounds coming from beneath the earth. Arnold retired 6 months after the Henderson exhumation. On his last day, he told his replacement, "Some folks don't rest easy, and some ground don't want to give up what it's holding. You learn to tell the difference. Have you ever encountered something in your line of work that made you question the natural order of things? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes the most terrifying truths are buried just beneath the surface. Not all rest in peace.